everyone, and welcome to my first series of true crime fan videos. And before we actually get started and jump into the first video, which today I will actually be covering Serial and the Adnan Syed case in its entirety, I'll be talking about multiple aspects here. I'll be going through basically everything I've been exposed to when it comes to Serial. I'll be going through the actual Serial podcast itself by Sarah Koenig. I'll be giving some commentary on the Serial podcast, as well as one of my current addictions, which is the Serial Dynasty, or now the actual Truth and Justice podcast by Bob Ruff. Additionally, I wanted to spend maybe just a minute or two of this video talking about the two books that are currently available related to the case. The first one, of course, is Rabia Chaudry's book, just titled Adnan's Story, and the second would be McClain's book, which is entitled Confessions of a Serial Alibi. But like I mentioned, before we get into all of that, I wanted to give you guys an introduction about who I am, just so you guys know a little more background. My name is Heidi, and I am a recent graduate of the University of Central Florida's Master's in Communications program. So I do have a master's degree, but just a disclaimer, I have not been to law school. So, all this exposure to these true crime stories, I'm just like most other people, I'm kind of learning as I go and realizing very quickly the multiple flaws in the criminal justice system. Another disclaimer before we start, just that, of course, since we're talking about the Adnan Syed case, wanted to mention that as far as Hayes' family is concerned, the victim in this situation, I might bring up certain aspects about her, but if I do, just keep in mind, everyone watching this, that I have the utmost respect for Hayes' family and, of course, Hay herself. And also that all people discussed throughout this brief little YouTube video are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. So to start off here, I'm going to do what the Serial podcast does at the top of every one of their episodes and just talk about Adnan himself, my feelings on him, and, basically whether I feel he is guilty, innocent, none of the above, did a third person do it? Did one of the serial killers that were supposedly on the loose do it? So basically, I have, just to give you guys an idea of my exposure, I've listened to all of the original Serial podcast. I've listened to every episode related to the Serial Dynasty / Truth and Justice podcast on Adnan's case. And I have listened to probably only 4 or 5 episodes of Serial because it seems like it was more of a timely endeavor and would have been more advantageous for me to listen to right after going through the original Serial podcast, because it's more of a reaction podcast. But as far as Adnan goes, right now I'm actually leaning towards believing in his innocence. And I have to say that is mostly because of the Truth and Justice podcast. For those of you who have also listened to this podcast, really the main benefit of it is that Bob goes so in depth with every little detail of the case. And honestly, I even got more out of it probably than I did from Undisclosed, the Rabia Chaudry, Colin and Susan podcast, just because he was actually critiquing Undisclosed and even going into more depth than Undisclosed did. So if any of you out there are wondering, maybe you've just listened to the Serial podcast, I would say the best way to do it is to go from Serial to Undisclosed and then to Truth and Justice episodes, because they sort of, each of the podcasts kind of builds off of one another in that respect. So back to my main point, basically after hearing all the little nuances of the case and, having listened to everything being picked apart by Bob in the Truth and Justice podcast, I'm now leaning toward Adnan's innocence, heavily toward his innocence. And if I had to specifically name anyone as a quote-unquote prime suspect, once again, all the people talked about here, most of them are still alive for the most part. So keep in mind that they are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. But if I had to make any type of a statement like that, I would say Dawn is the most suspicious character, at least in my mind. Now, my reason for that, they are multiple different reasons that support that. The main one has to do with the whole issue surrounding Hayes' vehicle, finding Hayes' car. A lot of people were saying, on Reddit, in multiple different aspects, Bob Ruff even questions this himself throughout his podcast, that, Jay took the cops to the car. How is Adnan supposedly innocent if Jay took the cops to the car? Jay said that he was involved in the burial. There is a lot of circumstantial evidence that points towards Adnan's guilt. Well, that is not quite clear. I don't want to, definitely spoiler alert if you haven't listened to Truth and Justice yet. The car incident it's brought up in Truth and Justice and Undisclosed. But basically, there are multiple different facts and different aspects of evidence to support the fact that the car was found before Jay led the cops to it, supposedly led the cops to it, because at this point, I'm not even sure. And honestly, that's the difficulty about this case, is every time you think you believe something, you think a certain amount of evidence points towards something, what happens is you just end up questioning yourself over and over again, and it basically just becomes a big loop of questions. Personally, I was leaning towards Adnan's guilt after simply listening to the Serial podcast, but once you really start digging into the case and listening to Undisclosed, listening to Truth and Justice, even listening to Serial, you'll start to just, like I've said, big loop of questioning your sanity, questioning the existence of your life on this planet, questioning the criminal justice system. Basically, it just leads you down this rabbit hole to the point where you start questioning everything and you are suspicious of everyone. And that's personally also how I feel like a lot of discussion is going on surrounding the third party people, which in this case would be Ronald Lee Moore, and I believe, even Mr. S. You could throw Mr. S in there as a third suspicious person. And there was one other person, I can't remember the exact name right now, of course. I have my notes here, but there's so many things that I couldn't jot down everything I was going to talk about in my notes, honestly. There's just too many twists and turns with this case. So in order to prevent this video, especially since it's my first video, from being 20 minutes long, what I'm going to do now is hit on these other aspects I talked about and just talk about, actually let's move on to talking about the books here. Now, Rabia Chaudry's book was released pretty recently. I believe it was the beginning of August or beginning of September. I might have to clarify that in the little description box at the bottom of the video. But either way, Rabia Chaudry's book is called Adnan's Story, and I wanted to bring up a brief image of it here for those of you that might not have downloaded it yet or physically bought it. So this is Adnan's Story, and the subtitle on this is The Search for Truth and Justice After Serial. So there's been a lot of interesting discussion about the book. I've personally read through probably 80% of it. There were some parts that I kind of strategically skimmed through just because it was a lot of repeated information from Undisclosed and or Serial. But for the most part, I enjoyed it. I liked the fact that there were a lot of personal touches with getting to see some of Adnan's letters from prison. There was also the handwritten pages of Asia McClain's Alibi letters that he had wrote in the beginning of the case. So there was a lot of little things and also some investigative points for those of you that are interested in seeing documents related to the case. There are also some official documents. Obviously, she couldn't put in some of the more seriously official ones related to the case, mainly because, the PCR hearing that's going on and everything like that. There's still aspects going on related to it being in court, so clearly they're not going to put every little document in there for the public to see. However, I thought it was really well written. It was very, very detailed, and it looks like it's something that she has probably been working on for, I would guesstimate, probably for years, because you don't just write like a 200-300 page in-depth report / personal narrative story within the course of like 6 months. You can't just slap that together. So it was, personally, I think, a good read. I would say, I'll say that some people in the reviews section were just commenting about how it's the same information over and over again and don't waste your money. I personally don't agree with those sentiments because I did get a few extra things out of the book. And if you are someone like me who's basically been absorbing almost every little detail that I can about the case and questioning every little detail, I think you'll enjoy it. So I would recommend to anyone watching this video to check out Rabia Chaudry's book. Once again, that's Adnan's story. And the second book that's out related to the case is Asia McClain's book. This one is called Confessions of a Serial Alibi, and this one came out well before Rabia's book. So I'm just going to go ahead and once again show you guys the brief glimpse of the book cover here with my Kindle. So this is Serial Alibi, or Confessions of a Serial Alibi, written by Asia McClain, Chapman. So if you're having trouble, if you just type in Asia McClain, she also has a different married name now. It's Asia McClain Chapman. And this book, it doesn't really have a subtitle, but it says at the bottom of the front page here that it's a diary of murder and an unlikely alibi witness as featured on This American Life's hit podcast serial. So just gives you a little overview if you're not sure what this is related to, but I'm assuming if you're looking this book up, you're already familiar with Serial, in my opinion. But as far as that book is concerned, I have only a disclaimer here. I have only read through a sample of it, which was still a pretty good size sample, about maybe 20, 25 pages or so on a Kindle. And basically, the one thing I liked about this book is that it was written in a very narrative, flowy, easy to follow format. In the very opening chapter, when she introduces it, the part that I've read so far, it's basically just talking about her life in Baltimore and sort of giving you an idea about her background. And then I'm assuming further down the line, people feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm assuming then it starts to go into what happened on that day, January 13th, 1999, and how she personally remembers speaking to Adnan in the library. But I haven't decided if I'm going to go through and actually pay for a digital copy of Confessions of a Serial Alibi, simply because I was happier to actually purchase Rabia's book, because I knew going into it that it's going to go through every detail of the case. It's going to give more of a personal firsthand story because of her relation to Adnan, whereas this book, I think, actually, as she describes in the beginning, it's more of an effort to get everything off her chest and to help her feel comfortable with coming forward and supporting him, even though it's 15, 16 years later. So it's more of a micro look into the case, whereas Rabia's is more of a macro look and really gives you a full picture. But for those of you who, like I mentioned earlier, just want to get your hands on anything and everything related to Serial, that option is also out there. And I've pretty much gone through everything, I think, that I have to say related to the case. Obviously, I didn't discuss the facts of the case in terms of the murder of Hae-Min Lee and, exactly what happened, because if you're watching this video, I'm assuming you know the basics of what went down on that day, January 13th, 1999, without me having to really go into too much detail on that. So if you haven't really heard about it, if you just happen to come across this video randomly, definitely go ahead and listen to Serial. Start off with Serial first. Don't, listen to any critical reviews on it until you've listened to the original podcast. And thank you. I want to thank everyone for joining me. This is my first experience with video blogging in a while, and I'm hoping to spice things up as far as getting graphics, getting pictures, incorporating various things in these videos. Right now, I think I'm going to keep it very basic and just pretty much directly upload this from my webcam. But in the future, look forward to some more interesting videos. And this is going to be a video vlogging series related specifically to true crime and my experiences with various true crime stories. So just to give you guys a flash forward on what I'll be covering, I think the next thing, I have a series of video ideas written down here. That's what I'm glancing down at off camera. And I think one of the next things I'm going to cover, just because it's probably a little bit lesser known, is this recent Netflix documentary I watched entitled Who Took Johnny? And this covers the Johnny Gosch kidnapping from 1982. Now, I personally wasn't around to see the tragedy and hear everything related to this case because it was back in 1982. However, I wanted to cover this because it was a really well-made documentary, and it was a watershed case when it comes to missing children and, setting better laws in place to help law enforcement find missing children, as well as a variety of other topics. If you've already watched the documentary, then you know what I'm going to be going into. It's not for the light of heart. But once again, I'm going to be placing a disclaimer on these videos and or at the bottom of these videos, basically just reminding everyone that a lot of these people I'll be discussing are still real people, to respect their families, and to basically just, the purpose of these videos is just to provide commentary and provide my reflections as someone who is a viewer. All right, and so like I mentioned, thank you guys for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. And to all of my serial junkies out there, hope you have fun listening to all these podcasts and delving into the 2 books that are currently out. Bye, guys.